Shalom, I'm Chris. Let's follow Jesus along the Talmidim way. Genesis chapter 38. This is the story of Judah and Tamar. Acts 17:11 reminds us to be Bereans. We receive the word with great eagerness and examine the scriptures daily to see whether these things be so. And many people consider Genesis 38 the roughest chapter in the Bible. A lot of people won't even touch it because of the subject matter that it involves. It's things that we don't typically discuss in polite company, but it is in the Word of God. And when we examine the scriptures, we see why it is here. It actually turns out to be critically important. The story starts in a town of Adullam, and that is in the Judean hills, really where the hills meet the lower land, and the lower regions called the Shephelah. And so this is where Adullam is, and what's interesting is the text literally says Judah went down to visit his friend the Adullamite. So if he's in Hebron, it is truly a lower elevation to get to this place, Adullam. And it's one hint that we seem to look at this chapter and we say, okay, what is it doing here? Genesis 37 started the story of Joseph. Genesis 39 will resume the story of Joseph. But what's interesting is Genesis 38 verse 1 says Judah went down to Adullam, and Genesis 39 also begins with went down. It says, now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, albeit it's in the passive voice, but it's the same verb, to go down. And so those two verses really tie these chapters together. What's interesting about Adullam is David will later hide from Saul in these caves. So it's a very soft, like chalky ground here, and they build caves out of them. 2 Samuel 23, verse 13, then 3 of the 30 chief men went down and came to David at the harvest time to the cave of Adullam, while the army of the Philistines was camping in the valley of Rephaim. So all of these valleys here, in fact, Adullam is just south of the Elah Valley. And the Elah Valley is where David and Goliath took place. So all of this is very familiar territory to David. We have this place called Timnah. And curiously, in verse 12, while the chapter begins with Judah went down to Adullam, it's going to say he's going to go up to Timnah. And possibly, but not definitively, this is the same Timnah that's marked by the arrow there in the Sorek Valley. That is the location that is featured in the Samson story. And so this is not that far from Adullam, relatively close. And it's interesting that in Judges 14, we get another geographic reference. It says Samson went down to Timnah and saw a woman in Timnah of the daughters of the Philistines. So it's very curious that Samson is described as going down to Timnah because he is also descending spiritually. He's not where he's supposed to be. He's supposed to be set apart and compromising and all that. And so while it's interesting that this town is where Judah begins to, it's the beginning of the story of his spiritual ascent to seeing what is going on, which we will get to at the end of this story. However, with that said, a lot of scholars believe that this mention of going up indicates that this Timnah is presumed to be at a higher elevation. So he's going up somewhere in the Judean hill country. We don't know where. But it's very interesting. You have this town of Timnah. That is, you think of Timnah and you think of Samson. That was his area. And nothing good really happened with Samson. And there's going to be, you have to search far and wide to find the good in chapter 38. And it came about at that time that Judah departed from his brothers and visited a certain Adullamite. And again, the underlying text says went down, whose name was Hira. Judah saw there a daughter of a certain Canaanite, whose name was Shua, and took her as wife and had relations with her. So several questions emerge from this. First is, why is this chapter even here? Why do we have this interlude in the story of Joseph? Well, it's interesting. Genesis 46:12 is going to note that the grandsons of Judah will migrate to Egypt. And again, this is the royal line. And so we need some explanation of how these sons came to be. This chapter turns out to be pivotal in the line of David as well as the line of Jesus. And so God in his providence, inserted this chapter here. There's also the connections we mentioned. Both 38 and 39 have the same Hebrew phrase, went down. And so there's a connective thread there. The Jewish sages calculate that 22 years have passed since chapter 37. So a long time has gone since Joseph departed for Egypt. Next question people ask is, why is Judah now separated from his brothers? Well, we have to remember from chapter 37, it was Judah's idea to sell Joseph. So even though he prevented his brothers from killing him, which would be the more wicked crime, the tradition says, based on the reaction of Jacob when he grieved over the loss of Joseph, the other brothers blamed Judah for this. And so they ostracized him, and eventually he gets sent away. And again, this is a traditional story, but it fits with human nature, right? The criminal mind always wants to blame someone else or something else for his or her predicament. So dad's upset, we have to blame Judah because it was his idea. The next question is, what in the world is he doing with a Canaanite? He's supposed to be of the royal line. And note that the Shua is the Canaanite man's name. We're going to get that clarified later. The wife is actually unnamed. She's the daughter of this guy, Shua. Note that Judah is engaging in the exact same behavior that his uncle Esau did, and that was take a Canaanite. And that is the behavior that vexed Isaac and Rebekah. So it drove them crazy that Esau was taking Canaanites. So again, why is Jacob engaging in this behavior? He's of the chosen line, Jacob. He may not know it yet, but he stands to be the next in line. After Reuben had defiled his bed and Simeon and Levi, committed the atrocity at Shechem, now Judah is now disqualifying himself by marrying a Canaanite woman. So he's blowing all that. And of course, when we take the bigger picture, we see all of this as satanic attacks on the royal line. Hasidic teaching, interestingly, that's a branch of Orthodox Judaism. They see all of this chapter as having messianic overtones. And so in the midst of the spiritual darkness, they would say the light of Messiah is breaking forth, because at the end of the chapter, we're going to see that the Messiah's line continues. And she conceived and gave birth to a son and named him Er. Then she conceived again, gave birth to a son, and she named him Onan. She gave birth to another son and named him Shelah. And it was at Kazib that she gave birth to him. So again, this wife is unnamed. And as it turns out, these offspring, as well as the Canaanite wife, turn out to be entirely irrelevant to our narrative. But it makes for a very interesting story. And we have to get here to get to the end of the story to find out who these people are. We don't know where Chazib is. There isn't a town called Achzib that's referenced in Joshua 15:44, which is in the vicinity of Jerusalem. So this could be where all this is happening. Now Judah took a wife for Er, his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Er, Judah's firstborn, was evil in the sight of the Lord, so the Lord took his life. So again, here we have a messianic hint in the name of Tamar. Tamar's name means date or date palm or date palm tree. Palm trees have been associated with the Jewish Messiah going back to the days of the Maccabean revolt, and so they crowned their conquerors with greeting them with palm branches, and we know that from Palm Sunday, right? The Messiah is greeted with palm branches. Many commentators speculate that Tamar might have also been a Canaanite, but we have to admit the text doesn't tell us either way. Usually we're told when someone's marrying a Canaanite wife. So first Esau does, and then Judah does earlier in this chapter. So the lack of that mention leads some others to conclude that Tamar was Hebrew. But we just don't know. But we're going to find that of all of these names, she's the most righteous person in the entire chapter. So Er did evil in the sight of the Lord. And so the next question is, well, what was this sin that Er committed? We aren't sure, but this is the first mention of what in Hebrew says they did wicked in the sight of the Lord. And this is a phrase that we will see frequently in the books of Kings and Chronicles, talking about the wicked kings of Judah and Israel. They're always said to do evil in the sight of the Lord. So whatever it was bad. And those other kings that had this same phrase said about them were usually involved in the occult. They were involved in driving people away from the Lord. They were involved with corrupt gods and setting up false worship and that kind of thing. So we can guess that Er's sin has something to do with that. It's very interesting that Er is spelled Ayin Resh, and evil is spelled resh ayin. And so you kind of get this play on words and this pun where error was ra'ah in the sight of the Lord, and just the same two letters flipped around. Then Judah said to Onan, have relations with your brother's wife and perform your duty as a brother-in-law to her, and raise up a child for your brother. Now Onan knew the child would not be his. So when he had relations with his brother's wife, he wasted his seed on the ground so that he would not give child to his brother. But what he did was displeasing in the sight of the Lord. So the Lord took Onan's life also. So that's the part of the chapter that one of the parts that a lot of people just don't want to teach and they find distasteful, and we'll deal with it politely as we can, but we can't. It's in the Bible, so we can't ignore it. First, let's look at what was this duty of a brother-in-law. Judah is speaking here of an ancient concept called the Levirate marriage, and it basically says if a man died before he had produced an heir, then the dead man's brother was required to marry the widow and raise up a child in the older brother's name. And the term comes from the Latin name for the living brother. It's called a levir. And so the son of the Levirate union receives the inheritance of the firstborn son. And so this assures the widow would be provided for and the dead father's name would continue on. It eventually gets codified in Deuteronomy 25. If brothers dwell together and one of them dies and has no son, the widow of the dead man shall not be married to a stranger outside the family. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her as his wife, perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. And so when Judah says this is your duty, that this is what he's talking about. And it shall be that the firstborn son which she bears will succeed to the name of his dead brother, that his name may not be blotted out in all of Israel. So this has to deal with inheritance and continuing the line, continuing the name, as well as providing for the widow. So it was all very important and very honorable to do this Levirate marriage. So Deuteronomy continues to say that the levir may refuse the obligation. However, there's a public ceremony in which the widow shames the man through a very odd shoe ceremony. And then the widow takes the man's shoe and then spits on the man. So in a society that is built on honor and shame, this would have been highly shameful. And they tended to avoid acts that would bring shame on themselves. So a levir failing to perform was probably quite unusual. And so when we get to Ruth, we have probably the most famous Levirate marriage in the entire Bible. And so if you know the story of Ruth, Ruth is a Moabitess. Her husband dies. They move to Moab, and her husband dies. And she follows her mother-in-law, Naomi, who's Jewish, back to Bethlehem. And so Ruth is a poor widow. She's gleaning in the field. She catches the eye of this guy named Boaz. And Naomi says, hey, this guy Boaz is a redeemer. So, he has maybe this obligation to perform a Levirate marriage. Well, you get into the story and you can see it's a love story brewing. And then all of a sudden there's this, problem because Boaz knows there's this nearer kinsman. And the kinsman is first in line to inherit all that was his brothers, who was Naomi's Ruth's first husband. And but by the way, you also have to take this Moabite wife. So Boaz said in Ruth 4 verse 5, on the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you must also buy it from Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of the dead, to perpetuate the name of the dead through his inheritance. And so then this guy says, well, I'll pass. The close relative said, I can't redeem it for myself, lest I ruin my own inheritance. You redeem it. You redeem my right of redemption for yourself, for I cannot redeem it. Now, then they go back to telling what this custom was. It was the custom in former times concerning redeeming and exchanging to confirm anything. One man took off his sandal and gave it to the other, and this was a confirmation in Israel. So we see this ceremony played out. And so we aren't sure why the guy reneges, but perhaps because Ruth was a Moabitess, the near kinsman doesn't have to endure this shaming ceremony, but does have to give up the shoe. And as Chuck Missler says, while to the man, his shoe is a mark of shame, to Boaz, it becomes a marriage license. But in any case, Ruth 4 is evidence that the peoples of the ancient Near East took this Levirate obligation seriously. And so the fact that this Onan character is, refusing to do that is really, it's a mark of shame on him. So that gets into what was the sin of Onan. And so the word for wasted there is his seed was spoiled. And the Jewish sages actually name an entire category of sin after this guy. It's called onanism, and I'll let you look it up. But loosely and in polite company, it would be the term for any sexual act that intentionally avoids a pregnancy. Because God's command is to be fruitful and multiply. And so whenever a union does not result in a new life, you have to look at it in some sense. God's will was thwarted there. Now, there could be natural reasons why this didn't happen, but in Onan's case, he was making sure it didn't happen. So it's interesting that today the world looks upon pregnancy and children as inconveniences that need to be avoided, or if they can't be avoided, then they need to be terminated. So it's interesting that what the world celebrates, God clearly calls a sin, because his command is to be fruitful and multiply. And there's a whole story you can get into of this god Ishtar. I'll save that for another day, but it's worth looking into, the fertility goddess that was all about sexual, what we would call sexual depravity. So because of this, the sin of Onan, Judaism as well as Catholicism, they all derive their positions on birth control from this passage. And so as a result, they tend to have very large families. However, we are told that sin begins in the heart. And this is what Jesus is talking about in Matthew chapter 5. So in a larger sense, the sin of Onan is really covetousness. His firstborn son would not actually be his, but his deceased brother's. And then that son would stand to inherit all that would otherwise go to Onan. And so Onan was now next in line, and he was unwilling to let anyone get in the way of that. So it was pride and covetousness that we can maybe think of more polite ways to describe the sin of Onan. His heart was just wicked. And so it's interesting that Judah is here made to experience the death of his sons after his role in causing Jacob to grieve over what Jacob thinks is the death of his son Joseph. So it's definitely the law of sowing and reaping is in play here as well. And Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, "Remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up." For he thought, "I am afraid that he too may die like his brothers." So Tamar went and lived in her father's house. Now after a considerable time, Shua's daughter, the wife of Judah, died. And when the time of mourning was ended, Judah went up to his sheep shearers at Timnah and his friend Hira the Adullamite. So Judah believes that Tamar has somehow played a role in his son's death, maybe unlucky, bad omen, whatever, but he doesn't want to lose his third son the same way, and so he puts her away and says, well, don't call me, I'll call you, kind of thing. Remaining a widow in that day was a very tough assignment. She would have had zero rights, zero inheritance. She would have been resigned to a life of childless poverty, and even had to wear special clothes that marked her as a widow, and we'll see a reference to that a little bit later. The clothes would have entitled her to glean in the fields and receive a portion of the tithe, but they also would have been a constant reminder of her low status. So really what Judah was doing here is denying Tamar's rights. And such as it was, he was actually disrespecting the memory of his firstborn son. And he could even be said he's dishonoring his own lineage here. He doesn't care. He's in the same way Esau despised his birthright, Judah is despising his lineage here by not following through on this requirement to provide for Tamar. And so he washes his hands of her. He probably is hoping she'll find someone else to marry, but Tamar has no intention of marrying outside Judah's line. And Tamar was told, "Behold, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep." So she removed her widow's garments and covered herself with a veil and wrapped herself and sat in the gateway of Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that Shelah had grown up and had not been given to him as wife. When Judah saw her, he assumed she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. Now we're getting into this grisly section here. So why is Tamar doing this? Well, most scholars would say that naturally or supernaturally, she had gleaned that continuing Judah's line is supremely important. And so the sages say that through divine inspiration of the Holy Spirit, she knew that she was to be mother in the line of Messiah. At the very least, she didn't want to be a childless widow. No woman wanted that. So she knew that Judah was reneging on his obligation to give Shelah, his last son, to her. And so at a minimum, Tamar was motivated to make sure that the obligations under the Levirate system were fulfilled. So it's very, very interesting that, again, we'll see that she's the righteous one in this whole story. Again, we have this thought of going up to Timnah after the death of his Canaanite wife. So even though he may not realize it yet, he is ascending towards his union with Tamar, which will preserve the Messianic line. So spiritually, he's going up as well as maybe geographically. We're not sure whether this is the same Timnah as the one mentioned in the Samson story. The text does appear to play on the town's names, though, to just juxtapose Judah's ascent and Samson's descent. And Samson was descending into sin and wandering away from where he's supposed to be. And unbeknownst to Judah, he's coming closer to where he is supposed to be. So like Samson, we're supposed to be set apart, and like Judah, we're supposed to praise. But both of these guys fall short. And that just reminds us that we fall short too. There but for the grace of God go all of us. And we need to be remaining faithful to God and be where God calls us to be. This gateway of Anaim is quite interesting. Your ayin is an eye or a spring, and Anaim is a dual form, meaning two eyes or even two springs. So this might have been a landmark rather than a town name, but she's at the city gate, which is where all kinds of business took place, including this kind of business that we're getting into here. It's a twist on the typical boy meets girl by a well theme that we have in the Bible. So if we take Anaim to mean springs, then we've got Judah and Tamar meeting by springs the same way. Eleazar met Rebekah by a well, and then Isaac later saw Rebekah at a different well. Jacob and Rachel met by a well, and we're going to see that Moses meets his wife by a well too. So Hebrew's flexibility gives way to a couple of deeper interpretations here. The opening of the two springs is interesting because Tamar is about to become pregnant with twins. So her womb is going to be opened with twins, just like the springs may be opened here. If we take Anaim to mean eyes, then we have the opening of the eyes. The sages teach that Tamar received divine inspiration, as we mentioned earlier, as she prayed to God about her predicament. And so she knew she was going to be in the line of Messiah. So her eyes were opened. Then we have Judah's eyes beginning to open here. They're not open yet, but he's about to see when he calls her righteous. Also, we have this theme of concealed identity. So just as Isaac and Jacob were tricked by concealed identity, also involving a kid goat, as we're about to see, now Judah is going to be tricked. And then only later after this will his eyes be opened. So he turned to her by the road and said, "Here now, let me have relations with you." For he did not know she was his daughter-in-law. And she said, "What will you give me that you may have relations with me?" He said, "Therefore I will send you a young goat from the flock." She then said, "Will you give a pledge until you send it?" He said, "What pledge shall I give you?" She said, "Your seal and your cord and your staff that is in your hand." So she gave them to her and had relations with her, and she conceived by him. So again, concealed identity, did not know that he was dealing with his daughter-in-law here. As Daniel Lancaster puts it quite mildly, Tamar's shocking maneuver here with her father absolutely stuns the unsuspecting biblical reader. And again, this passage is why people don't normally like to teach on this chapter. So recall that Judah's mother, Leah, also concealed her identity to Jacob. And so Jacob's concealed his identity from Isaac. So we've got all of this going on here. Joseph will later conceal his identity from his brothers. So Lancaster sees this pattern of concealed identities as pointing towards Jesus. The identity as Messiah remains concealed from the majority of Jewish people to this day. And it's interesting that they actually teach on how Messiah will be concealed. David was an unlikely hero. When we were in Israel, we heard a teaching on that and how he was unsuspecting and he didn't have the armor. He didn't look like a hero, but yet he was the hero of Israel. Judah should never have agreed to give all of this up because in our vernacular, he left his passport, his driver's license, and his credit card with her. And why would you do that, right? So these are, some commentators see these as Judah's credentials that he's now the official firstborn of the family, particularly the cord that he leaves there. The signet ring would have been used to make a literal signature impression in a clay seal, and the cord likely signified Judah was a person of importance. Again, perhaps the firstborn. So these cords would have been worn on the hem of the garment. They may have actually been the tassels on the garment also. Anyway, all of this was a form of identification and authority. And so we have this parallel, right, that he was willing to sell all of these for one night with a prostitute, just like Esau was willing to sell his inheritance and his birthright for a bowl of soup. So don't miss that this is all a satanic attack on the Messianic line. So Judah is sinning big time here, but what he means for evil, God will use for good. Then she got up and departed, removed her veil, and put back on her widow's garments. When Judah sent the young goat by his friend the Adulamite to receive the pledge from the woman's hand, he did not find her. He asked the people of the place, saying, "Where's the temple prostitute who has been on the road by Anaim?" But they said, "There's been no temple prostitute here." So it's very interesting. Okay, what was a temple prostitute? Many ancient religions, other than the Hebrew religion, they were all tied to fertility, and all of them relate to this god Ishtar in some way or another. They've got all these feminine gods and goddesses. Prostitution in Canaan was not on the fringe or underground the way we think of it today. In some respects, it's just what you did if you were a Canaanite and you wanted your fields and flocks to produce. And of course, Israelites were to have nothing to do with this. But so they believed that, if you wanted your flocks to proliferate, then you had to do an act of worship that was along those lines. And I'll just kind of leave it at that. Same thing if you wanted to have successful fields. So it was all tied to earth and financial, material productivity, and mimicking it by these temple prostitutes. So here, Judah is obviously compromised here. We don't know whether he was just giving a pretense or whether he truly believed the woman was a Canaanite priestess. It's almost like they're both really bad. If he truly believed she was a Canaanite, not only was he consorting with a prostitute, he was participating in Canaanite worship. So every indication suggests that because he'd married the Canaanite, he was probably practicing the Canaanite religion. And again, this makes Tamar, the only righteous person in the chapter. So now that it was about 3 months later, Judah was informed, "Your daughter-in-law, Tamar, has prostituted herself. Behold, she is also pregnant by prostitution. Then Judah said, "Bring her out and have her burned." So now that it suits him, what Judah's doing here is saying, you're legally engaged to Shelah, and therefore you're guilty of adultery, because in that day, if you were married or engaged, betrothed, and had an affair outside of wedlock, then you were dealing with adultery. So the underlying Hebrew word here for prostitution could mean any type of illicit sexual activity. So basically, they're saying your daughter-in-law has been promiscuous and is now pregnant by her promiscuity. Burning is not the usual penalty for adultery. That would have been stoning. Deuteronomy 22:23 speaks of that. So this is just a hot-headed, rash pronouncement here, but God will see that Tamar receives due process. In a way, this response here recalls David's response to Nathan. If you know that story, after David and Bathsheba had sinned, Nathan comes to David and doesn't immediately call him out for his sin. He instead tells the story of a rich man who had many flocks and a poor man who had only one lamb that this poor man loved. The rich man needed to throw a banquet. Instead of taking one of his own lamb, he took and slaughtered the poor man's lamb. And so 2 Samuel 12:5, then David's anger burned greatly against the man. And he said to Nathan, "As the Lord lives, the man who has done this certainly deserves to die. So he must make restitution for the lamb 4 times over, since he did this thing and had no compassion." And then one of the most powerful verses in the Bible, Nathan then said to David, "You are the man." And so then, David's repenting. He sees that all this is about him. And you see the same thing here. Judah's being hot-headed. Bring her out and have her burned. But we're about to see the turn of the phrase, turn of his opinion. And we might also compare all of this to Joseph's reaction when he finds out Mary is pregnant. He could have had the same reaction. But verse 19 of chapter 1 of Matthew says, Joseph, her husband, being a just man, not wanting to make her a public example, was minded to put her away secretly. So he was going to deal with it with more dignity. And so it's very interesting that both David and the New Testament Joseph are both Judah's offsprings. And so they're both related to Tamar. It was while she was still being brought out that she sent word to her father saying, I am pregnant by the man to whom these belong. Please examine to see whose signet ring and cords and staff are these. And then, of course, Judah sees this and he's convicted. He recognized them and said, she is more righteous than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah, and he did not have relations with her again. So we've got Judah's eyes open. He sees what was happening all along here. He was very incorrect to be rash and have her sentenced to death. And another example of sowing and reaping, in chapter 37, we had them presenting Joseph's coat with the blood on it. And the same word here, please examine whether it is your son's coat or not. Those are the exact same words that Tamar uses here. Please examine, whose are these? Let us know. So that sin actually comes back to haunt him now, using the very words that his brothers used on their father Jacob. The sages also note that Tamar could have publicly shamed Judah, but she let him come to the realization himself. And so there's a lesson for us. We should never seek to embarrass someone in public, even if we know we're right and they're wrong. Being declared righteous is like getting a not guilty verdict from the judge. So this is a big, big deal in this chapter of all of the things that look like she was doing wrong. She is now basically pronounced innocent. So in a very strange twist, she gave the signet and the ring and the cords and the staff back. So ultimately, she receives no payment in exchange for the act that she did with her father-in-law. So she's not guilty of prostitution in that respect. Since Shelah was not able to perform the duties of Levir, that left Judah as the next closest Levir. So he was the next in line. He should have done this. So the sages take a very favorable view of Tamar here. She was righteous because she claimed what was righteous, what rightly belonged to her. Judah was denying what rightly belonged to her, which were the Levirate rights. I didn't see this written anywhere, but there's a Jewish interpretation that if you have two commands in the Torah that conflict with each other, and one of those commands requires you to take a positive action, and the other command requires you not to take an action, that's called a negative command, then the person is to follow the positive command. So perhaps, not saying this is right or wrong, but perhaps the positive command for Tamar, which is as a wife to carry the firstborn son for her dead husband, potentially overruled the negative command not to engage in fornication. Again, don't want to take that too far, but it is something that crossed my mind in considering her righteousness. She was doing the right thing, even though it required her breaking a different commandment. And again, not something we should make a habit of, but there are those times where we have these ethical conflicts and we have to decide which is the right step to take. The preservation and furtherance of life always takes priority. And so in that sense, that's what Tamar is doing here. As we saw in Genesis 16, things can often go poorly when we take matters into our own hands. So we have to be very careful. And I don't know that there's any specific application for our lives today other than make sure and, we're seeking God's will for our lives and to always do the right thing. Not at all saying it's okay to go out and sin. But in this narrow case, Tamar was willing to bring shame upon herself and even risk a death sentence to continue the line. And that was her duty as she saw it from God. So her claim to righteousness actually hinges upon following God's law. So the only person in this chapter who we might say was man enough to stand up and make sure God's law was followed was Tamar, the woman. So we have to follow her example and just say, what are you and I willing to do for Messiah? Now, I'm not saying, we need to follow literally what she did, but we need to follow her example of always doing the right thing. And it came about at the time where she was giving birth that, behold, there were twins in her womb. Moreover, it took place that while she was giving birth, that one baby put out a hand, and the midwife took and tied a scarlet thread on his hand, saying, this one came out first. But as it came about, it drew back his hand, and behold, the brother came out. And then she said, what a breach you have made for yourself. So he named Perez. Afterward, his brother came out, had the scarlet thread in his hand, named Zerah. So we have this very similar thing of Jacob and Esau. When they were born, they struggle in her womb. And the one who is the apparent firstborn gets second status, and the one who's second gets firstborn status. So now we have to have a bit of a postscript as to why this story is critical. So let's go back to the book of Ruth and kind of pick up the rest of that story. So we've just had the exchange between Boaz and the nearer kinsman. They've exchanged the shoe thing, and Boaz continues in verse 10. Furthermore, I have acquired Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of Mahlon, to be my wife, in order to raise up the name of the deceased on his inheritance. So the name of the deceased will not be eliminated from his brothers or from the court of his birthplace. You are witnesses today. And all the people who were in the court and the elders said, we are witnesses. Moreover, may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, through the descendants whom the Lord will give you by this young woman. And as Chuck Missler says, if you know the story of Tamar and Judah, and you hear this so-called blessing, you're inclined to say, hey, same to you, pal. This doesn't sound like it's a good thing. But so what is going on with this so-called blessing? We have to remember this is taking place in Bethlehem. And so we have to immediately start thinking of Davidic and messianic implications. And as it turns out, this line, may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, turns out to be a prophecy. Deuteronomy 23 says, no one of illegitimate birth may enter the assembly of the Lord. None of his descendants, even to the 10th generation, may enter the assembly of the Lord. And you might be thinking, okay, great. What's this got to do with anything? Well, Perez and Zerah were both conceived under illegitimate circumstances, right? So no matter how righteous Tamar was, they were not married. So that was a problem there. So Tamar and Ruth both appear in Jesus' genealogy. And so if we turn to Matthew chapter 1, let's look at this and let's do some counting here. Let's add these up. Judah fathered Perez and Zerah by Tamar. Well, Perez would be first generation. Perez fathered Hezron, number 2. Hezron fathered Ram, number 3. Ram fathered Amminadab. Amminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz by Rahab. Boaz is the 7th generation. Boaz fathered Obed by Ruth. That's generation 8. Obed fathered Jesse. Jesse fathered David the king, the 10th generation. And that is just mind-blowing when you think about how precise the Bible is. And so that prophecy given in Ruth prophesied David ascending to the throne. So, was David an afterthought after the Saul experiment failed? Or perhaps was David predestined to be king before the earth was formed? Exactly 10 generations passed. And so that is fascinating. So despite the R-rated aspects of the story, this could be the most important chapter in all of Genesis. So whether Tamar fully realized the implications or whether she really just wanted to have a baby, we'll never know. But it turns out the entire Davidic line leading up to Jesus the Messiah all hinged upon her actions and hinged upon that line continuing. So again, this was, if we take a step back, this was a satanic attack. Satan had been focusing his attack on man. So we started with Adam and Eve's son, Cain and Abel. We know that story, thought he was destroying it there. And then as we get focused on Abraham, he tries to muck around with the line of Abraham by the whole Hagar thing in chapter 16. And then as we get focused, it's going to be the line of Jacob. Jacob gets attacked. Jacob's sons get attacked. And now we have this attack on the line of Judah. And these attacks will continue through David the king, which we read about previously. So Satan may have thought that he won this round. But at the end of facing the giants, you remember what they say, right? You tell me what's impossible with God. God has a way and can make a way, even through an R-rated chapter like this, even through uncomfortable circumstances. God's will prevail. So next time we will resume the saga with Joseph in Egypt. So we'll see you next time for chapter 39.